I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Garrie.
And together we are the History Boys, bringing you the issues of the day, yesterday, and even tomorrow from a historical perspective. Because, as I always say, if you don't know how we got here, you'll never know how to get out of it. We scrapped the original topic for today's discussion because, hey, the history books have come alive. And Winston Churchill, hero or villain, is actually running as the #1 item on the news. The proximate cause of that was a good old-fashioned anti-Labour smear. John MacDonald asked at a Politico event if Winston Churchill was a hero or a villain, correctly answered and has today further expanded, both. He was both a hero and a villain. From my point of view, he was a villain, worse than a villain, for virtually all of his 93 years of life. He was a hero for but a moment in time. It just so happens that that moment in time was the most important moment in time in the entire 1,000-year history of this realm. And if he hadn't been a hero for that moment, I'd be talking to you now in German. Somebody chided me about that on Twitter earlier today, pointing out what's wrong with speaking in German. So let me put it more bluntly. If not for that moment, when Churchill refused to surrender to Adolf Hitler, whose forces were at the French Channel ports, when all around him, from the palace, through the cabinet, through the back benches of the House of Commons, wanted to surrender, if he had not refused to surrender, not only would you have been speaking German, by which I mean you would quite possibly still be under the iron heel of a fascist jackboot. No Jew would be left alive on the earth, for all of them would have been annihilated. Perhaps no gay would have been left alive, no Jehovah's Witness, no communist, no socialist, no trade union militant, no gypsy, nobody with mental illness, perhaps nobody with physical disability would still have been alive. Just think about that. Because if not for Churchill's refusal to surrender, Adolf Hitler would have ruled the entirety of the European continent, and the British elite would have been rushing out to welcome his advancing forces, offering to sell them financial services. A red carpet would have been rolled out all the way from the doors of Buckingham Palace. Because only Churchill could have, and only Churchill did say no. We shall never surrender. Now, none of that, Adam, in any way minimises the sheer monstrosity of the rest of Churchill's life towards Indian people, towards African people, towards Arab people, towards coal miners in Britain, towards striking dockers in Glasgow, towards the fake siege of Sydney Street and Peter the Painter and all of that. This man committed crimes almost without number. And therefore it is possible to say, surely, that this man was a villain, was a monster, but was also the hero who, if he hadn't resisted Hitler, would not even have had to fight the United States, would not have had necessarily even to fight the Soviet Union. Am I right?
Absolutely right. And I think in order to begin to explore this larger-than-life figure who's reviled by some, beloved by others, in your case, a bit of both in various measure, I think we need to start with what the man said about his own historical legacy during his own lifetime. Churchill was indeed one such figure who could write about the history of Winston Churchill when he was still making it. And he said, "I believe that history shall be kind to me, for I in intend to write it. And as such, I think there's another Churchill quote, which
it's quite a good tip, that.
Quite, I should remember that, you know. Shan't we all? But there's another very interesting quote from 1939, and this was when Churchill was asked about Soviet policy towards Europe, and he defined it in the following way. He said, "Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma," and how much that statement could apply to Churchill himself is boundless. When he was describing Russia, a country with whom he had a very manifold and convoluted relationship, he was really describing his own political career, his own idiosyncratic ideology, and his own perception that varied a great deal, certainly within his lifetime, certainly in the 20th century after he died in 1965, and lo and behold, even in the 21st century, when Britain has other contemporary problems to worry about, to say the least, people are still debating the virtues and vices of Winston Churchill.
His life, of course, was a very long one. His public life began in the 19th century. He sided with the Cubans in the Revolutionary War against Spanish colonialism. He actually fought. He went there as a journalist, but as he did many times, he took up arms on the Cuban side against the Spanish Empire. As a journalist with the Pall Mall Gazette, he exposed the bestiality of British forces after the Battle of the Omdurman. He wrote of how the Mahdi's tomb was defiled, his skull taken out and used as a football by British Army officers and men. This caused a phenomenal outrage in London, because such things were best left unreported. But Churchill reported them. He also supported, in his early incarnation, the old age pension, for example. The development of the labour exchange. He was, at that time, a liberal. He became a conservative. It was said of him that he didn't just rat on his previous party, he re-ratted, being a conservative, then a liberal, and then a conservative again. So even before we reach the awesome moment of 1940-41, when Britain stood alone with Hitler at the Channel ports, he was a rather more complex character than many will now allow.
Absolutely so. From his father, Randolph Churchill, a very eminent parliamentarian of the late Victorian period in his own right, he inherited this idea of Tory democracy, a strain of radicalism within the framework of a Tory movement, which essentially wasn't an ideology beyond supporting the main institutions of the country, which meant monarchy, the sovereignty of Parliament, and the estates, meaning the traditional social order with an aristocracy at the top and a working class at the bottom. However, within that framework of basic Toryism, he advocated from his earliest political life incredibly radical policies, and indeed the very National Insurance Act of 1911 was something that he spearheaded. There were multiple reforms in terms of taxation, in terms of funding healthcare for the infirmed and for the poor, that Churchill was a strong advocate for. He was standing beside the radical liberal Lloyd George in 1909 in promulgating and promoting the People's Budget, at that time the most radically redistributive budget in the history of England, of Britain, and in many ways in the history of Western countries. And so Churchill was always someone that didn't have much time for party politics. He was very much a man of his own, and he depended more on personal friendships with fellow parliamentarians, with the barons of the journalistic industry, what I call the media industrial complex, and with other benefactors, because even though he had an aristocratic background, he had to work for his living, not least because when his father died, Churchill himself was left with comparatively little, but he had various habits which meant that money passed from his hands to those of others rather rapidly. So again, this man of contradiction, the working aristocrat, albeit not in a coal mine, but nevertheless working for income, very different than many of the Tory grandees of this period, even into the early 20th century. And in terms of Churchill's legacy and why I think it's so controversial. Beyond what he did, I think it's the fact that he worked through and eventually dominated a parliamentary system, which is very different than a dictatorship, a monarchy, or a presidential system. In all of these other systems, there are some bad men and some great men who largely use the institutions of the state itself to shape their legacy, this cult of personality. Parliamentary systems, which in my mind are absolutely superior to these other forms of government, allow for a collection of talent that sometimes supports each other at a personal level and sometimes doesn't. But there's never just one great man in a parliamentary system. There are many great men, and it was his interactions, his disagreements, his seemingly absurd, some would say eccentric divergences, even from friends of his, Leopold Amery, for example, on the India question, which makes him a figure that is difficult for some to venerate, but impossible for others not to venerate.
He had a simply monstrous sense of white supremacy, and within white supremacy, English, I'll say English, yes. Supremacy. He regarded, for example, the peoples of India as essentially subhumans. He referred to them as such openly. He referred in Parliament, in Hansard, to the, as it happened, Kurdish people in the mountains of Iraq when he ordered the dropping of poison gas on them. He said, I cannot understand the squeamishness of the House at the idea of dropping gas on uncivilized tribes, mountain tribes, he called them. Despite his horror at what happened to the tomb of Al-Mahdi, he absolutely despised Arabs. And I could go on across he basically regarded the world as divided between Asiatic and African hordes and the white race, and within the white race, all the others, and the scepter dial of England, didn't he?
Absolutely, and it's helpful to remember that Churchill's conception of empire, a very 17th century style of imperial mentality, was out of step even with those at his own time. Churchill was living in an age where people that were a bit more in tune to the winds of change, a phrase that wasn't yet quoted by Macmillan, his lieutenant later on, but they were in tune to the fact that people were demanding self-determination, they were demanding economic autonomy, and you get people like Joseph Chamberlain, his relation Austin Chamberlain, Churchill's school chum Leopold Amery, who said we need to turn the British Empire into a confederation or perhaps even federation of countries with a single sovereign and a single foreign policy, but with various economic autonomy internally, various attunements into the cultural characteristics of all these individual areas, and essentially preserve the British Empire by modernizing it and decentralizing it. This was one of the main points of debate within Britain from around the late 1890s up until the British Empire was really, really on its last legs in the middle of the 20th century. For Churchill, though, this was completely abominable. For Churchill, the idea that these people in India, in parts of Africa, in the wider Asian space that Britain was the predominant imperial power in, there was simply not a chance that these people could ever develop this autonomy. And a lot of his friends were actually disappointed in him for clinging on to this sort of pseudo-romantic, pseudo-eccentric, all parts horrific conception of imperialism. So even in an age when, kicking and screaming as it was, the imperial mentality was somehow and somewhat evolving, Churchill totally rejected it, and the most infamous moment of this rejection was his strident opposition to the 1935 Government of India Act, which proposed to set India up as a dominion on the Canadian model. Churchill was entirely opposed to this, and in this sense, a man who in other areas was somewhat inconsistent. His views on Asia and India in particular were constant from his period as a journalist in the 1880s and 1890s, when his first remark remarks about disparaging Indians became public, to his parliamentary record in the 1935 debate, his views were completely consistent on that matter. Anything that appeared to surrender, meaning anything that went in the direction of moderation towards India, was for Churchill not only unacceptable, but in his mind, borderline treasonous.
Anathema, yeah. Now, just for the avoidance of doubt, he didn't like striking British workers any more than he liked these Asiatic and African hordes. He was quoted, at least, maybe you'll tell me it's apocryphal, as so many of his quotes are, when told that the striking miners in South Wales were hungry. He said, then we'll have to put some hot lead in their belly. And indeed at Tonopandi, which was the proximate cause of John Macdonald's remarks, which have been seized upon by the right-wing media and the political class, one of the strikers there was killed. 2 strikers were killed in Liverpool. Tanks were on the streets of Glasgow, tanks, in 1919, with the rent strike and the great trade union upheaval. In the general strike, he was effectively a generalissimo for reaction, for the ruling class. He wanted to absolutely smash and crush the miners. So he didn't like the British working class really any more than he liked the Indians.
And he didn't like Stanley Baldwin, the leader of the Conservative Party through much of this time, the general strike in particular, who was horrified at this element of Churchill's personality. And so while it might seem like a contradiction that Churchill was one of the early advocates for a minimum wage, for national insurance, for housing for the poor, schooling for the poor, that he then unleashed this militant, literally militant violence on the working class, they think, how does that add up? Churchill had an explanation for that, as he had an explanation for many of his own perceived idiosyncrasies. He saw that radical liberalism and socialism were essentially incompatible, where many on the left instead saw them as somewhat of a natural progression from one to the other. For Churchill, radical liberalism meant the owners of the means of social progression, the elites, the traditional social classes, should indeed reform, should expand government. If it was America, they'd say Churchill liked big government, and he was part American after all, according to him, even part Native American. So he, along with Lloyd George and the liberals of the pre and just about post-First World War era, they expanded the social security net. They built the early stages of the welfare state. But what Churchill did not like was the idea of the working classes themselves taking power, what the snobbish amongst our audience might call agency, in terms of forwarding their own agenda. It was one thing when people like David Lloyd George and Sir Winston Churchill were legislating in Parliament on behalf of the working class, but the minute the working class took matters into their own hands, particularly by creating a Labour Party, a party which in those days, quite unlike today, was a party by and for the working classes, he opposed that entirely. And so Churchill actually talked about this dichotomy a lot when people would ask, why is it that among the liberals, which between 1906 and 1924 he was a member of, why does he oppose working class people standing up for the very rights that the Liberal Party, at least to some degree, wanted to give him? And that's because for Churchill there could only be social progress if there was an airtight grip on maintaining the social order that he felt anything to the left of the British Liberal Party was an inexorable threat to.
He utterly abhorred Bolshevism. He led the drive for the invasion of Russia in support of the White Armies seeking to defeat the new Bolshevik power. He spent what is the equivalent in 2019 of £4 billion maintaining an actual British army in Russia, trying to overthrow Lenin and the Bolshevik government. And yet the same man was a champion of the wartime alliance with Stalin. Indeed, For a man who was determined to write his own history, to his credit, I believe, he was absolutely unapologetic about affording to the Soviet Union, the Red Army, and Stalin the lion's share of the credit for the defeat of Hitler fascism.
And this is another interesting aspect of Churchill's career. Churchill was by no means an anti-fascist. He supported Generalissimo Franco in Spain. He supported, at least prior to 1939-1940, he supported Hitler's friend Mussolini in Italy. He had quite a lot of good things to say about the barbarous Japanese aggression against China in the 1930s. And so in this sense, Churchill wasn't so much guided by an opposition to Hitler fascism. He was opposed to the idea of a großer Deutsch Reich, a large German empire in Europe, which he saw as a threat to British hegemony. And while Churchill had a very touch-and-go relationship even with pre-Bolshevik Russia, he was of the point of view, which again was in the minority among the British elites at the time, that as the Russian Empire, later the Soviet Union, bookended continental Europe on one side, and Britain, the British Isles, bookended it on the other, that it was somehow a mutually beneficial alliance for Moscow and London to unite against a Napoleonic-style Central European empire. And that's how he saw Hitler, and he wasn't entirely wrong. Just because Napoleon's ideology was the ideology of French expansionism, and Hitler obviously had a much wider and much more horrific ideology, it was the Napoleonic characteristics that Hitler had, and boy did he have them, right down to making the mistake of invading Russia in the winter, that angered Churchill so much about Hitler. And that's why even at a time when he was virtually cheering on Japanese torture of the Chinese people, even at a time when he was saying that Franco and Mussolini represented a renaissance of a post-First World War European continent, he was in the wilderness, outside of the front benches in the 1930s, arguing in the House of Commons from the back benches against this notion that while Hitler is rearming, Britain should be cutting back on its armaments. And he excoriated the French, obviously, for doing the same at the same time.
In these, his wilderness years, he kept up a withering attack on the and was very prescient in what Hitler was going to do. But the British ruling class didn't want to hear it because they hated Bolshevism just as much as he did, and they hoped that Hitler would march upon the Bolsheviks rather than on the Low Countries and France.
This is one of the main differences, because the funny thing about Churchill is he wasn't a dogmatic ideologue. That's one of his virtues, because dogmatic ideology means that one doesn't look at the evidence, one doesn't look at the realities on the ground, but one shapes one's actions by this idyllic reality that doesn't actually exist except in theory or in imagination. So while others thought that the creeping communism in Europe was something that whoever defends it should be, fights it should be supported, Hitler saw it in these classical Napoleonic chess board terms of Germany's the center, and when the center expands, it can expand in both ways. The thinking among most members of the Tory party at this time, people like Lord Halifax, people like Chamberlain, people like the, frankly, much maligned Stanley Baldwin, a man whom Churchill never had a good personal relationship with, although he had a decent personal relationship, funnily enough, with Neville Chamberlain, even though he attacked his father Joseph witheringly in Joseph's halcyon early 20th century imperial preference days. For Churchill, unlike the others, the problem of communism and the problem of German imperial expansionism were a toss-up, and it was geography itself which dictated that the further away menace is going to be the temporary ally against the much geographically nearer menace. Others saw it in completely the opposite way, so much so that Hitler actually had a lot of support among elements elements of the British aristocracy, elements of the Conservative Party, elements of the Liberal Party, and they thought so because they thought that Hitler was something of a dam that would prevent a tidal wave of red Bolshevism from coming into Europe. And so in this sense too, Churchill was actually the anti-ideologue because he saw things from his military strategic background, from his romantic background, rather than a more rigid ideological background. So in this case, his hatred of ideologies actually proved to be a pragmatic asset to the survival of a British state where Parliament reigned supreme rather than one in which Adolf Hitler would have reigned supreme.
Well, in the last few minutes, let's get counterintuitive, counterfactual. We're back. France has fallen. Hitler's at the Channel ports. He's planning to invade and subjugate Britain in the way that at that stage all of Western Europe had been subjugated. Halifax and other appeasers want to make a deal with Hitler. Indeed, are secretly, through back channels, through the Italians, the Italian fascist government, sounding out what would Hitler's terms be. Would he allow Parliament to continue? Would he insist on Mosley becoming the Prime Minister of Britain? Would Britain be allowed to keep its empire if it now surrendered? All these people, and we now know that right up into Buckingham Palace itself, in the city of London, amongst the rampantly anti-Semitic British upper class, the surrender lobby, the make a deal with Hitler lobby, was enormously powerful. And in their way stood Winston Churchill. How did he manage to pull that off? Did he go over the heads of the cabinet to the Parliament? Did he go over the heads of the Parliament to the people? It is one of the great turning points, the greatest turning point in British history, because it would have been far easier for Churchill to say, well, we're beaten. Dunkirk has driven us off the continent. The European countries folded like cheap tents. We can't face this alone. The Americans will not come into the war. There is no need for the Soviet Union to do so. And therefore we must face the pragmatic fact that we are defeated. Tell me what you think was going through his mind and how he managed to pull it off.
I think that at this particular point in early 1940, Churchill saw himself the way he saw England. He saw a man who had defied the political trends in other places. He saw himself as a man who literally stood alone. He saw himself as a man whose supreme confidence in himself could succeed against odds that most people thought would have been insurmountable. And in this sense, it was Churchill's ego, not without some cause, that ended up saving Britain, because he associated the cause of Winston Churchill with the cause of Britain and the empire that he loved so dear.
Now, I mentioned earlier about all these apocryphal quotes. I myself was guilty earlier this week of imagining that he had coined the phrase, "No man is a hero to his valet." And I said so in relation to this poisonous book about Jeremy Corbyn, written by Tom Bauer. He didn't actually say that. He didn't actually say many things, including, you've just educated me, as you always do, what I thought was one of his very best aphorisms. Tell us about it. It was in relation to the Royal Navy.
Indeed. Well, Churchill, in spite of his army background, he was very much someone who favoured expanding what would become the Royal Air Force. He was definitely one of the key people who allowed the RAF to become what it became by the time the Battle of Britain took place. But in one of his apocryphal arguments with someone over naval policy, he said, apparently, "Don't talk to me about naval tradition. It's nothing but rum, sodomy, and the lash." Years later, someone approached Churchill and said, "Did you actually say that?" And he said, "No, but I wish I had."
So there we have it. I think we are agreed. Hero or villain? Answer, both. killer of British workers, Irish people, killer of Indian people, killer of African people, killer of Arab people, monstrous white supremacist imperialist. And how's this for a paradox? The only reason that you and I are free to have this discussion now, here, in our own language, on the History Boys. How's that for a paradox? I hope you've enjoyed it. We are the History Boys. I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Garrie.